Nothing to see here, folks. It describes the attitude that so many in society have right now surrounding the vaccination mandates that are currently being implemented around the world. Mandates like the ones in the United States that are coercing doctors, teachers, nurses, policemen, and so many others to choose between getting vaccinated or losing their job. What's been particularly frustrating for me is to see many of my people that have an understanding of the principles of Revelation 13 as it relates to force and coercion, looking at what's going on with indifference. I've heard arguments that vaccine mandates have always been a part of American society, ever since George Washington had his army vaccinated for smallpox. In other words, nothing to see here, folks, for since the American forefathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of the United States. And of course, I'm being a little facetious by referring to 2 Peter 3 verse 4. But the point that I'm trying to make is that yes, there have been mandated vaccines to get into schools, universities, and other specific places for decades. But listen, what we are seeing happening around the world is different. It just is. What we are seeing is not normal. For example, my friend recently texted me to let me know that in Quebec, the government has threatened to suspend the licenses of nurses who do not want to take the COVID-19 vaccinations. In other words, if you don't fall in line, not only are you going to lose the job that you have right now, but you will not be able to get another job anywhere else in Quebec, as obviously these nurses will not be able to practice without a license. Basically, we are going to take away your livelihood until you comply. And by the way, the same government leader that passed this mandate in Quebec is the same one that wanted to shut down everything on Sundays early on in the pandemic.
We're facing a long and tough battle against the virus. We'll need to keep our spirits up and to keep our forces. That's why we're announcing today that businesses will now be closed on Sundays, except for gas stations, pharmacies, convenience stores, and takeout in restaurants. It will be an opportunity for our workers to get some rest. Quebecers must remain united to win the battle against the virus.
That should at the very least get your prophetic senses tingling. As a people, as a church, we need to have something to say about that. I'm not saying that we have to march in the streets along with the hundreds of thousands around the world that are currently doing so, like in France and in New York and in Australia, where the government has emphatically stated by their policies, "Why won't you let me protect you from COVID?" Again, I'm not saying you have to protest in the streets, but as a church, our voice needs to be heard, speaking out against coercive methods that we know will be eventually used against Sabbath keepers. I see it all around me. I see it on the screen every day as thousands lose their jobs. I see it in the situation of a close family member that will be losing a job they've had for 12 years because they're not comfortable getting vaccinated. This is a real thing. It's happening all over the world, and our fellow brothers and sisters in Christ from every nation, kindred, tongue, and people are dealing with this. Despite what I know I'm looking at on the screen, as these mandates get more and more restrictive, like the ones in Los Angeles, where they're trying to prevent unvaccinated people from even buying and selling at the mall. Despite the fact that you have people like Don Lemon calling for others to not be able to go to the supermarket.
Don't get the vaccine, you can't go to the supermarket. Don't have the vaccine, you don't show it, can't go to the ball game. Don't have the vaccine, can't go to work. You don't have the vaccine, can't come here. No shirt, no shoes, no service. That's where I think we should be right now, because we continue to waste our breath on people who are just not going to change. They're, the circular logic. They just keep going back and saying, well, it's my freedom, it's whatever.
Despite these things, the silence remains deafening among so many of us. I've heard this silence before. I heard it during the summer of 2020, as I watched with many of you as we saw George Floyd murdered on camera by a police officer. When this happened, so many people simply said, "Nothing to see here, folks. He was a criminal. These things happen in a sinful world and are not part of the three angels' message, so we shouldn't even talk about it." After all, Ellen White says silence is eloquence upon such matters, and Jesus did not attempt any civil reforms. And now that some in our church are seeking to defend civil liberties by speaking out against these vaccine mandates, I'm hearing the exact same silence is eloquence argument now as it relates to the vaccine mandates. And the same don't interfere with the civil authority statements when it comes to people losing their livelihoods. The interesting, and dare I say ironic thing, is that many of the people who are most vocal now at the unjust vaccine mandates were silent when it came to speaking up for minorities in the summer of 2020. And now, so many of the people who were most vocal during 2020 are silent now when it comes to civil liberties related to these vaccine mandates. So, with that in mind, I really want you to help me by answering this multiple choice question. As a church and as a people, we have to decide who we are and what we should speak up about. So, should we A, have been silent about the injustice against minorities and vocal about the unjust vaccine mandates? B, we should have been vocal about injustice against minorities and silent about unjust vaccine mandates. C, say nothing about either. Or D, say something about both, because both are relevant to displaying the character of God as it relates to injustice and liberty of conscience. This is what I think. I think that during the George Floyd protests, the world came face to face with what it looks like to be a minority and suffer abuse. And one day, Sabbath keepers, no matter what race you are, will be a minority. So, how should we respond to abuse against minorities now? Now, when it comes to the vaccine mandates, I think we are seeing firsthand what it will look like when, as Sabbath keepers, our civil liberties will be restricted, as we will not be able to buy or sell. So, how are we responding to this injustice today? Even if we're not personally affected by something, we should still be compelled to say something in our sphere of influence, like the people who spoke up last year even though they weren't minorities, and like this nurse who is vaccinated but stood with her fellow workers to say that what is happening is not right.
Nurse Sarah Castillo, however, does have the vaccine, but still believes her coworkers should be given a choice.
I am vaccinated. That was my personal choice. But I choose to stand with my coworkers who have decided not to. They've done their research. Their belief is that they should not be getting this vaccine. My job is to stand with them, just like I would stand for any patient who refused treatment.
You see, that nurse gets it. The prophet Habakkuk got it when he cried out to God, when he saw injustice around him and proclaimed that the law is powerless and justice never goes forth, for the wicked surround the righteous. Therefore, perverse judgment proceeds. You can and should say something when people are abused based on sex or race or anything else, when people are losing their jobs, their livelihoods, and in some cases their lives over mandated vaccines. Now, I won't be hitting the streets to protest the vaccine mandates. I didn't join Black Lives Matter or hit the streets to protest in 2020 either, but I was compelled to say something then, and so I said it in the docuseries My Burden, where I shared my experiences of racism and how we should respond to racial injustice. And I'm compelled to say something now, and so I did, as I highlighted the death of a woman who died after receiving a mandated vaccine in the video entitled Tough Noogies. I firmly believe that these conversations need to be had in and outside of Adventist communities as it relates to our understanding of the character of God highlighted in the three angels' messages. I firmly believe that as we get closer and closer to the test of Revelation 13 and the second coming, that Christ is trying to show us how our preferences and our biases are misrepresenting his character. And so, before you answer the multiple choice question I presented earlier, for yourself, I want to invite you to take a look at the videos that I mentioned earlier, and then ask yourself if, as a people, we are reflecting the same biases and polarization that we see in society, and speaking up or remaining silent based on those biases. If we are guilty of that, then our message will continue to lose its power as society looks at what Adventists have to offer and says, nothing to see here, folks.